gotten into, and after a long hiatus, I'm back and better than ever. So what I've decided to do with my channel is to gear it more towards true crime and just chit chat type of videos. So if that's the type of content you're into, make sure to hit that bell button so that you can stay notified every time I post. Today we're going to be discussing the Ken and Barbie killers, who were a couple that commit many different rapes and murders throughout Ontario. So I already know this video is going to be super long, so I'm going to try to keep it as factual as possible and try not to ramble as much. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into the video. So before we start off with all the horrific crimes that these two had commit, we're going to start off by understanding who they are. So I'm going to start off with Paul Bernardo because he was the leader of all this torment, and he had also committed many crimes prior to the killings. Okay, so Paul Bernardo was born on August 27th, 1964 in Scarborough, Ontario, and he was the youngest of 3 children. He is known to have been a sweet child. He was known to have a charming smile and just have been a charming guy overall. However, he did have a difficult upbringing. His father had actually sexually abused his sister. And Paul Bernardo's father, Kenneth, was also charged with child molestation in 1975 for fondling another young girl. On the other hand, Paul's mother was pretty absent throughout his childhood. She is said to have had depression, so often on weekends she would leave them unattended and go to her other relatives' houses and stuff, and then she eventually retreated to the basement. So back to Paul for a second. He is said to have seemed oblivious throughout his childhood of the broken home he was growing up in because he always seemed to be a happy child. However, at the age of 10, he did gain a compulsion to begin to set fires when he was in the Boy Scouts. So let's fast forward a bit to when Paul is 16. So this was when he found out that the man he's been calling dad is actually not his biological father, and I believe he found this out through an argument he had with his parents. And like any teenager, finding out what they had thought they've known all this time was actually false, he was very upset and it broke all trust he had with his parents. So at 16 years old, Paul also began to look through his female neighbors' windows and watch them undress any chance he really got, basically just being a peeping Tom. Now, if you notice a pattern here, he began with having a compulsion to set fires to now peeping through the windows of his female neighbors. However, as he started getting older, his fantasies started getting darker and darker, and peeping through windows just weren't cutting it for him, but he wasn't yet acting on these fantasies. Now let's just leave all that dark stuff behind for a second. In December of 1983, Paul Bernardo started studying at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus, otherwise known as UTSC, for accounting. So the people that knew him while he was in university really liked him. He is known to have been 6 feet tall, very handsome, very charming, as I said before. Everyone just wanted to be around him. He was able to make friends with just anyone. And he was honestly just known as the life of the party at that point. But during this time, he also had many girlfriends. And these relationships would often start off picture perfect. And then as time went by, like any other relationship, usually is when they'd start having issues. However, these relationship issues were usually based on their sexual relationships as it began to turn more abusive, sometimes violent and more controlling. And this is often when his girlfriends would break things off with him. So that was a little insight on Paul Bernardo, but like I said before, the Ken and Barbie killers were a couple. So let's start talking about the other counterpart of these killings, which was Carla Hamoka. Okay, so Carla Hamoka was born on May 4th, 1970 in Port Credit, Ontario, and she was the oldest of 3 daughters. So growing up, Carla was known to be very liked in school. She was a very bright student and a very good student, honestly. Now, Carla Hamoka, just like Paul Bernardo, didn't have the picture-perfect home life. She had an alcoholic father who would often insult her, her mother, and her 2 sisters when he would be in his drunk episodes. From a young age, though, Carla was known to be stubborn and domineering, as she was unable to compromise with other children her age, and she was always willing to speak her mind to other adults as well. So Carla actually grew up in St. Catharines, Ontario, and she was known to be very pretty and somewhat popular. So she did have a lot of boyfriends in school, and a lot of boys were interested in her. However, it is said that later on in her adolescence, she began developing sadistic and masochistic fantasies. And when she met Paul, Paul was all she could talk about, like no other boys could come near her. So for those of you that aren't from Ontario, Scarborough is about an hour and a half drive away from St. Catharines. So this starts to kind of pose the question of how did Paul Bernardo and Carla Hamoka meet? So basically, when Carla was 17 years old, she was a high school student who also had a part-time job at the local pet shop. And at the time, Paul Bernardo was 23 years old in UTSC studying to become an accountant. So basically, on October 17th, 1987, Carla Hamoka was in Scarborough, Ontario in a hotel attending a pet food convention, and at nighttime with her coworker they decided to get food, so they went down to the hotel restaurant and they were just sitting there eating like one does. And that's when Paul Bernardo walks in, and Paul and Carla make eye contact, and it was like love at first sight, or honestly it's more like lust at first sight. But yeah, apparently they just had this instant connection. Paul approached her, they started talking, and it went so well that the coworker that came with Carla actually ended up leaving so that she doesn't get in the way of the two of them. So basically they just stayed in the restaurant until it closed, just talking, and then once it closed, they both went up to Carla Hamoka's hotel room and became intimate. So after this, they basically just got into a relationship, and Paul was all Carla could talk about. That was her dream man, so she told her friends. And the feelings seemed to be mutual because Paul had allegedly told some of his friends that it was just a match made in heaven, and that him and Carla were basically ride or dies, and just like how much he wants to be with her. So now that we've covered who Paul Bernardo is, who Carla Hamoka is, and how they both met, let's get into some of the crimes leading up to the killings. Okay, so in spring of 1987, there was a sexual predator roaming the streets of Scarborough, Ontario. By May, there had been 7 different reports made to the local police by women of these attacks. So the first few reports that were made were just about a man groping women, but after about an year with no suspects and no one in custody, the attacks started getting a lot more violent. So at the time, police did what they could do, and they went on TV and warned all the women watching to not go out at night. If they are to go out at night, like don't be alone. And they were just trying to warn people of the dangers that are still roaming the streets. So basically, how these attacks would happen is that the attacker would basically like grab women from behind when they're walking alone from the bus stops at night, and sometimes even on their evening jogs at the park. And what they would do is basically get them behind a bush or somewhere a bit secluded and attack them there. So the victims of this predator were forced to perform oral intercourse, sodomy, and were sometimes beaten afterwards as well. And the media basically gave the name the Scarborough Rapist to this predator because they didn't know who it was, and it was happening in the streets of Scarborough, so the media did what the media does. So with the attack still happening, this whole city is on high alert, and there were many statements made by both witnesses and victims. However, the police didn't really have any leads because these people usually didn't get a clear view of the attacker's face because they were attacked from behind, plus it was nighttime. So it was just really hard. All the information they really had was that this attacker was young, he had light colored hair, and he was good looking, and he was tall, which honestly does not narrow it down at all because this could be literally anyone. So at the time, police were still trying to figure out who this predator was. So they were able to collect 100 DNA samples, but unfortunately none were a match. So at this point, the Toronto police decide to get in contact with the FBI and call them in for reinforcement. So basically what they wanted was the FBI profile to give them a profile of what they're really looking for and who this guy was. So the FBI profile that was brought in to help with the case was actually able to link 4 more attacks to this predator. So there was a total of 11 attacks in total. So what the FBI analyst was able to determine was that these attacks were anger-based and sadistic in nature, which is apparently a rare combination. And they concluded that whoever this person was very dangerous, which was pretty obvious. I'm just going to read off of my laptop what the profiler said because I don't want to get it wrong. But basically, the profiler said that this was a high-functioning, intelligent, psychopathic, sexually sadistic offender, believed that the attacker also resided in the area and most likely in a family household. And they also believed that this person had to be in their early 20s and had to have had violent relationships with women. So just think about that profile and think about who you think that is. Okay, so now we're just going to rewind a bit. We're going to go back to Paul and Carla's relationship and some family insights of what Carla's family thought about Paul. And yeah, just basically all of that. Okay, so if you guys remember, Paul and Carla met in fall of 1987, and at the time, there was already 3 attacks linked to the Scarborough rapist. However, Carla never suspected Paul because she just thought he was such a good guy and he was just so perfect and he was just a dream. It is even said that Paul would show up to Carla's house often with flowers and other gifts any chance he really got, and he just treated her really well at the time and was just like this perfect boyfriend, I guess you can say. And it is said that Carla and Paul's relationship seemed to go very quickly as they were just so infatuated with each other. They couldn't keep their hands off of each other. And at this point, they were together for I think 18 months. And Paul would drive over from Scarborough to St. Catharines several times a week just to see Carla. So you can say things were going really good. And it was also said that Carla's family really liked Paul. They thought he was a great catch. He was well educated. He was handsome. He treated Carla nicely. He treated them really good. And overall, they just thought he was just such a good guy. And they didn't mind the age difference at all either. So that was a plus for him, I guess. So in spring of 1989, Carla graduates from high school, and at this point, she's thinking about what she's going to do in the future, what path she wants to go through, just everything a high schooler that's graduating thinks about. But it seems that they're starting to have issues with their relationship now because Carla went from telling her friends all the time how perfect this guy was to now saying that he is becoming a bit verbally abusive towards her. However, every time they argued, Paul would bring flowers and just apologize for his wrongdoings. He would give like gifts and stuff as like an apology, and Carla always forgave him, and then they would just move on from there. So they stayed together, and in December of 1989, they went on a little romantic getaway to Niagara Falls, and that is where Paul gets on one knee and proposes to Carla, and of course, Carla says yes. So of course, Carla being excited, she goes home, she tells her parents that she's engaged, and her parents seem thrilled because they love Paul, and to have Paul as a son-in-law, they just were thrilled. So then Paul and Carla decide to set the date of their wedding to spring of 1991. On May 29th, 1990, the police released a sketch of what they believe the Scarborough rapist looks like to the press. So basically the sketch was everywhere. It was on the front pages of all the newspapers, so basically everyone was seeing it. Now this wasn't all too good for Paul because Paul's friends began seeing this and were like, hey, like, did you see this? It kind of looks like Paul. And that's when one of Paul's best friends called the Toronto police and say, hey, like this sketch looks like my friend Paul Bernardo. So the police ended up making a note of that, but I don't think they really acted upon it just yet. However, by November of 1990, there were several people that have contacted the police saying that the sketch looked like this guy named Paul Bernardo. So at this point, police are like, okay, like who is this guy? They go and find him, they bring him back for questioning, and then they ask him if they can get a DNA sample, which Paul gives them willingly. Now at the time, there were hundreds of DNA tests that they needed to test regarding this case and other cases, and at the time the DNA testing technology was not as quick and efficient as it is now. So there was hundreds of these DNA samples just sitting on shelves waiting to be tested, including Paul's. So it actually didn't get tested for a while, so it was just sitting there waiting, collecting dust basically. So after being questioned, he decided to move to St. Catharines with Carla. But what both of them had decided was that they would live with Carla's parents and her two sisters because they didn't have enough money to get their own place just yet. So their plan was to live with them and save money, and then once they can, they'll go and get their own place. And at the time, Carla's parents had no problem with this because, like I said, they loved Paul. They didn't think that he had anything to do with these attacks, and neither did Carla. So like I mentioned before, Carla was the oldest of three daughters, and her youngest sister was named Tammy, and she was 15 years old at the time that Paul moved in with them. And like the rest of her family, she also loved Paul. So like I had mentioned earlier, Tammy was 15 years old at the time that Paul moved in. And she actually loved him. She looked up to him like the older brother that she never had. However, Paul, on the other hand, started to develop these dark fantasies towards Tammy. And he would watch her undress when she wasn't aware through her window. He would go into her room while she's sleeping and masturbate. And honestly, he just began getting really obsessed and having these really dark urges towards Tammy. So then Paul decides to give in to these urges, and he tells Carla that he wants something that Carla can't give him. And basically just starts to guilt trip Carla that he wants a virgin. Now Carla felt bad because she wasn't a virgin when they met either, and she just wanted to please him at the time. So what Paul decides to say is, hey, like, the closest thing to your virginity is your little sister's virginity. And he just continues to just pressure her and say this stuff to kind of manipulate her into helping him do what he wants to do. So at the time, Carla just wanted to please Paul because she felt like he would leave her otherwise. So she basically was down to help him. So then she and Paul make this whole plan to how he's going to get Tammy's virginity. So basically the plan was to drug Tammy so that Paul could rape her. So they did do a first attempt in the summer, July 24th to be specific. And basically what they did was they laced Tammy's meal with Valium or something. And that was supposed to make her unconscious so that Paul can rape her. But she regained consciousness within a minute and he was not able to rape her. So that attempt basically failed. So then a second attempt was made on December 23rd, 1990. Carla's entire family had gone to bed, but Carla and Paul had told Tammy to stay up so that they can all sneak some alcoholic beverages together. And I think it was supposed to be like an early Christmas gift to Paul from Carla. But what they did was Carla made the drinks and she ended up stealing some animal tranquilizers at her workplace because I think she worked at a veterinarian at this time, and she put it into Tammy's drink. And I think this tranquilizer was able to pretty much knock out anyone, so she just felt like it would work on Tammy for this case. Now what she also did was she soaked a rag in halothane and she held it over Tammy's mouth while she was being raped. And basically it did work. She was unconscious and Paul did end up raping her. Paul and Carla did end up videotaping the whole thing on a camera. And then when Paul was done, he told Carla that it's now her turn to assault her own sister. And Carla did. And they also videotaped that. So a little bit after these attacks, Tammy ends up vomiting and she ends up choking on her own vomit, which freaks out Carla and Paul. So they quickly hide the camera. They hide like pretty much any evidence. They put Tammy's clothes back on, and then they call the ambulance. And when the paramedics arrive, they tell the paramedics that they tried to perform CPR on her, but like it's just not working. And then the paramedics take her to the hospital where she is later pronounced dead. So one of the doctors that were actually examining Tammy noticed a chemical burn around Tammy's mouth where the halothane-soaked rag was held by Carla. But when Carla and Paul were asked about this, they told the doctor that it was just a rug burn, and that like when she started choking, they had to like get her off the bed, and then like that's how like the burn came about and like all this stuff. And that seemed to be a good enough answer for the doctors. And they ended up just concluding that Tammy, at the age of 15, died of natural causes. So at the time, Carla's parents were obviously devastated that their youngest daughter had died, but they honestly thought it was a tragic accident, so Paul and Carla got away with it. Okay, so moving forward, it is about a month later, and Paul and Carla have saved up enough money to get their own place. So they end up moving to a two-story home at Port Dalhousie, which is a small town near St. Catharines. So after they moved is when Paul's abuse towards Carla became more prominent, and he would often jokingly tell her that he's the Scarborough rapist, but I think at the time Carla wasn't really taking it seriously. And he went from being just verbally abusive to now physically abusive as well. And so, with all the abuse that Carla was enduring, she would threaten to leave Paul, but Paul will threaten her back, saying he's going to go to the police, and he has the videotapes as proof that she was involved in her sister's death, and he's going to just like basically go and snitch on her. So, like, his mindset was if he's going down, then she's going down with him, and he would just blackmail her with that. And of course, at that point, Carla just felt like she really couldn't leave. So then they stayed together. So then on June 15th, 1991, 2 weeks before Paul and Carla's wedding, Paul comes home with a surprise for Carla. And you wouldn't guess what this is. It was a 14-year-old girl named Leslie Mahaffey. So how was Paul able to get this 14-year-old girl to his house? So basically, Leslie Mahaffey was in her own backyard when Paul noticed her and pulled up in his car, and he offered her a cigarette. And when Leslie approached the car and got in, Paul basically abducted her and took her home. And now that he got her in their home, both Carla and Paul kept her captive and assaulted her repeatedly, and they also videotaped these assaults. So, just when you think the story doesn't get worse, it does. So, after holding her captive for about 24 hours and just attacking her throughout, they end up strangling her and then dismembering her body. So, how they actually got rid of these pieces of her body was that they mixed it in with concrete, and then they discarded of these concrete pieces with the body parts in their local lake called Gibson, I believe. So then on July 29th, 1991, Carla and Paul have their wedding ceremony, and they basically get married with, I think they had over 100 guests. And that same day, the concrete pieces were discovered in the lake by a local fisherman. So of course, news travels fast, and it was all over the news, and the police were just looking for any clues as to who this teenager's killer was. And that is when they decided to call in the same FBI profiler in that they had called in for the Scarborough rapist case. So at the time, the FBI profiler didn't really feel like he had any connections to put both the cases together, so he didn't. And at that point, they didn't have any leads either regarding the case of Leslie Mahaffey. So time went on, and the couple is living life as newlyweds, but Paul just seems to want more, and he's just giving in to all his dark fantasies at this point because he keeps getting away with it. So over the next year, Carla would invite a bunch of Tammy's friends over, and they would end up drugging and sexually assaulting them, but these girls would survive their attacks. They would wake up the next day with no recollection to what had happened the day before, so a lot of them didn't even know that they were sexually assaulted. But a lot of these attacks were also filmed on camera, so Paul and Carla did keep souvenirs, I guess. So on April 16th, 1992, Carla and Paul go on an afternoon cruise, but their only intention on this cruise is to find themselves a new sex slave that they can keep captive and sexually assault. And in doing so, they found a 15-year-old named Kristen French. So basically what happened was Kristen was walking home from school when the couple had spotted her and they grew an interest to her. So what they did was they kind of drove a bit past her into this church parking lot. And when Kristen eventually was walking past the church parking lot, Carla, who was sitting in the passenger seat, called her over like, hey, can you help me? Like, basically just asking for directions. And they made it seem legitimate because Carla was holding a map. And so when Kristen ended up approaching them, they ended up abducting her, putting her into the car, and just taking her home. So Kristen ended up being reported missing not long after, and there were a lot of witnesses that came forward because if you remember, this was after school, so it was still daytime, there was still people on the roads. So they had mentioned that they saw Kristen talking to a car with two people inside, and they said that they believed the car was a beige Camaro. So this is what the police were going based on, and there was a bunch of billboards, posters and stuff made with a beige Camaro saying like, have you seen this car, and like just trying to get any leads towards where Kristen French could be. However, what the police unfortunately did not know was that the eyewitness reports were actually incorrect, and Paul actually drove a gold colored Nissan and not a Camaro, so basically they were just sent on a wild goose chase. So then the media begins doing what the media does best, and the media starts to connect the Leslie Mahaffey case to the Kristen French case. And the FBI profiler is called in again at this time, and I'm just going to read you the description that the profiler gave. So the profiler described the suspect as being a white male in their late 20s, probably had a history of sexual violent crimes, a history of domestic violence, and he's someone who was most likely violent in their personal relationships, and there was still no connection made to the Scarborough rapist at this time either. So then Paul and Carla end up keeping Kristen French for several days this time, and they did the same thing, assaulted her multiple times, videotaped the whole thing, and then when Paul was satisfied, they ended up strangling her and killing her. So then on April 30th, 1992, Kristen French's dead body was found 30 miles away in Burlington in a ditch near a cemetery. So let's go back to Paul and Carla for a second. In January of 1993, Paul ends up beating Carla so bad that she has to go to the local emergency room, and he ended up beating her with a torch, I believe, and she had 2 black eyes, severe bruising, and a broken rib. So then at this point they had been married for 2 years, and this is when Carla decides to call it quits. So around this time, Paul's DNA was also being tested for the Scarborough rapist case, and his DNA was positively matched as the person responsible behind these attacks. So then police finally end up connecting these cases, and before going straight for Paul, they decide to go for Carla first because they felt like they could get some more information from her. So they decided they're going to drive a wedge between their relationship and just see if Carla knows anything that can help them really get a strong case against Paul. So then when Carla gets called in, she thinks that she's being questioned for the domestic abuse because she did go to the hospital for it. But when she quickly realizes that this isn't the case, she ends up going back to her family home where her parents live and where they used to live. And she ends up just breaking down and confessing to everything to her parents and like saying how scared she is, that like they know about her involvement in all these killings. And at this point, she just wanted to tell her parents before they find out through other means. So then her parents end up suggesting that she hire a lawyer, which Carla does end up doing. And she does tell the lawyer that Paul is indeed the Scarborough rapist. And she tells him about her involvement in the 2 local murders and in the murder of her own sister. She even agrees to testify against Paul in exchange for a shorter sentence for herself. And police end up agreeing to these terms as they needed a strong case against Paul. So then Carla sits down with the police and gives them a full confession. So then on February 17th, 1993, Paul finally gets arrested, and they ask Carla to go back to their home to ask her to kind of do a run through of where things took place with the two local murders that she was involved in. And so she does. And at this point, Carla keeps telling police that she was forced to participate in these crimes, and how like she didn't actually want to participate, like she was forced, like basically pinning it all on Paul. But what she also tells them is that there are videotapes that they can find, and it's somewhere in the house, and like it'll be proof basically against Paul. So after Paul is arrested, they spent 71 days searching the home for the videotapes, which they could just not find anywhere. And this was really bad because without these tapes, police had no direct evidence linking Paul to these crimes. So what they end up doing is arranging a plea deal for Carla, because at this point they're just really relying on Carla's testimony. So they arranged this to give Carla a shorter sentence for her to testify basically. But they did all this without the public knowing, which really upset the public. So on June 28th, 1993, Carla appeared in court for her involvement in this case, but there was a public ban during this court date. So the public was enraged because their right to know was being denied. So then Carla is sentenced with manslaughter and is sentenced to 12 years in prison. The plea agreement is still said to have been kept secret because they wanted Paul to have a fair trial. So yeah, Carla is sent to prison at this time. And then on August 2nd, 1993, Carla ends up filing for a divorce from Paul from within prison. And then on May 28th, 1995, Paul appears in court and he pleads non-guilty on 9 charges regarding the cases of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, for charges such as kidnapping, unlawful confinement, aggravated sexual assault, and murder. So the prosecutors end up showing the new evidence that they had found that wasn't brought about before, which was the videotapes, which they somehow found within this time frame. And this basically was the first time they had direct evidence linking Paul and Carla to these crimes. So obviously seeing these tapes, they felt like Carla completely misled the authorities with the events that did occur. And the authorities were like pissed at this point because they had already agreed to her plea deal and they couldn't really go back on that. So at this point, the only thing Paul's team could really say was like, yeah, Paul is in the tapes, but you can't see him murdering anyone. And they basically just said that Carla was the one that murdered these girls. However, on June 19th, 1995, Carla ends up testifying against Paul. And that's when she basically says that she's a victim of Paul as well, and he was the mastermind behind everything that went down. And then when authorities asked Carla about the tapes, she basically said that she was a victim too, and she was suffering from battered wife syndrome. And that was basically her reasoning behind why she really got involved. So then the judge ends up allowing the jurors to watch the videotapes, but only lets the public listen to the videotapes because they didn't want the families to go through more grief than they already are. So then Paul's trial ends up lasting for months, and the jurors end up deliberating for I think 5 hours before coming up to a verdict. And then on September 1st, 1995, 31-year-old Paul Bernardo was found guilty on 9 charges, including 2 murders. And while Paul was in prison, he ended up admitting to 14 more sexual assaults of women in Scarborough. So Paul is able to get parole after 25 years, but because the judge labeled him as a dangerous offender, it will most likely impact this, and he most likely won't be able to get parole at all. However, on July 4th, 2005, Carla, at the age of 35, was released from prison. And like I said, she only had a 12-year sentence because of the plea deal, so she was released. I believe she now lives in Montreal, if I'm not wrong. She has a husband and 2 sons, I believe, although I don't think they live together anymore. And she tried to change her name, but the city actually denied this because of her history. And there was an incident where she was volunteering or working at like an elementary school or something, which was so problematic on its own. And yeah, there was just so much that went down with that, because how did they allow that to happen? Like, where was the criminal reference check? Like, I just don't understand. But that all happened. But yeah, that's Carla. She's out and about. But yeah, how do you guys feel about this case? It was honestly a lot, and I personally can't even imagine living through it. I don't know. It's just weird to think like this happened in Scarborough. But yeah, I don't know. How do you guys feel about the case? I'm gonna actually say a fun fact that like I heard. Let me know if this like makes you guys think differently of Carla, or if you guys just think like she deserves to be behind bars still. I personally still think she deserves to be behind bars, but like, I don't know. Maybe she was actually a victim. I don't know, but I don't know. It's really hard to feel bad for someone that did all that. But anyways, I'm just gonna read the fun fact. Let me know if this changes your view on Carla, or if you still think she belongs behind bars. But the fun fact is, according to Graham Glancy, a forensic psychiatrist hired by Bernardo's defense, Hamoka appears to be a classic example of hybristophilia, and an individual who is sexually aroused by a partner's violence and sexual behavior. So Bernardo actually scored 35 out of 40 on the psychopathy checklist, making him a dangerous offender and likely psychopath, whereas Hamalka, on the other hand, scored 5 out of 40. So what do you guys think? I don't know. I personally just think they're both horrible people and they both deserve to still be behind bars, but I don't know. To each their own, I guess. Okay, so that concludes my video. If you guys made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I know it was a long one, but yeah, this is the first of many, guys, so I promise I'm gonna improve over time. But yeah, let me know if you guys liked hearing like the backstories as well, like who they are and stuff, or if you guys just want me to go straight to the crimes. I personally like knowing the backstories just because I like knowing who these people are and like what they've gone through growing up and stuff that kind of leads them to what they do, I guess. But yeah, let me know. Also let me know like if there's any cases you want me to like cover. But yeah, that's basically it. So I'll talk to you guys in my next video, which is gonna probably be a chit chat video. So yeah, thank you guys for watching again. If you guys like the video, then give it a like, comment if you want, and subscribe if you want, and like always, keep shining.